Hey everyone, welcome to Solving the Riddle, the podcast that unpacks the financial puzzles shaping your future. I'm Andrew Whitewood, and together with Alec we explore the ideas, behaviors, and strategies that help people make smarter financial decisions and build lasting wealth. Welcome to our first ever podcast. Alec and I are super excited today, but before we hop into our podcast, we'd just like to provide you with a little bit of context. Just get you to understand what we are actually trying to achieve today and what has actually gone into this podcast. So Alec, please, this is really your brainchild at the end of the day. I'm partnering with you on the show. Give us some context, give us some feeling. Where's this all coming from?
Yeah, well, I think COVID accelerated the advent of podcasts, brought them out into the open. I've been listening to podcasts slightly before COVID, but during COVID even more so. And I had this idea that was just an idea somewhere in my mind. And about 2 years ago, 18 months ago, started accelerating and started playing with brands and so forth. But like anything in life, sometimes we procrastinate. Cool. We get stuck, we want to get started with something, and we wait for the perfect day. But the perfect day never arrives. The lesson here is you have to get started sometime. Fortunately for me, I was sitting in an audience one day and I heard about Ready Aim Fire. And I reached out to the team at Ready Aim Fire. We had a few meetings and they've come on board to help us with this. And yeah, so here we are, the birth of the podcast.
I think the big thing from my side, Alex, is also financial literacy, right? We sit in the back office, we see clients on a day-to-day basis, and there's so many stories we can share, little nuggets, little learnings. I think financial planning is all about its holistic strategic picture. But I think the key thing for me is I want to share our learnings. Our world is very complicated, and what I would love for us to do is to break it down, make it relatable, and also exciting for people to get them going on this journey of financial independence at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of people have said to me when I've told them we're going to be going with a podcast and what's it going to be, they said, but Alec, you're the running guru, you're the running coach, you're a triathlete. Why not a running or triathlon podcast? And I said, you know what, I've got such a passion for financial planning and helping people to achieve their goals and get across the finish line. And I believe that we can make far more of a difference with this type of podcast. And that's essentially the thing, trying to solve the riddle.
And you spoke a bit now about your personal background, and you can already see I'm getting quite excited. Let's intro ourselves. Let's give people a little bit of information, context about who we are. So please, you fire away and then I'll step in.
Okay, well, I've been in the financial planning industry for just over 20 years. Back in 2010, I employed a young guy who was my assistant at the time. His name is Andrew Whitewood, sitting right next to me here. And we worked together for about 7 years. I realized that this guy had incredible talents, moved off to Cape Town, and he's back in Port Elizabeth. I'm excited about that. We're working together as a team now. You've helped me generate new energy for this podcast. Married to Michelle, 2 children, Cameron and Jamie. Cameron lives in the UK. Some great news the other day. She's just fallen pregnant. And then I've got a son, Jamie, who's a professional triathlete, who's been to the Olympics. And and I've got a couple of stepchildren as well, which is great, Justin, Kim, and Murray. So a big, large family, but wouldn't have it any different.
Yeah,
yourself?
So I think, Alec, from my side, you gave me an opportunity back in 2010. So everyone, this is Mr. Alec Riddle. He was Financial Planner of the Year in 2009. So I've learned from someone that's obviously super experienced, well respected in our industry. But I left Cape Town not too long ago. I spent about 7 years in Cape Town. I took a step, Alec, as you know, out of financial planning into the asset management world. With the backing of Private Wealth Management, we set up a Cat 2 business, an asset management business, and that business has done really well. But my personal passion and my vision, mission, and goal was to get back into financial planning. And you always knew this, the business knew this, and I made the decision, obviously, together with my wife, Lindy, to return to Port Elizabeth. The back end of last year, we brought my 2 little girls, Scarlett and Mackenzie. I've got twins, Linz and I. Had them 7 years ago. They just turned 7, and we settled back into Port Elizabeth, the lifestyle in Port Elizabeth, and it was a massive change for us personally, but also from a career and corporate point of view. this is the journey I want to be on. And as you can all hear, I'm sure I'm super excited to be partnering with Alec on our financial planning journey and just helping clients at the end of the day.
Yeah, and one thing you didn't mention, because you're quite a humble guy, Andrew is managing director of Private Wealth Management Wealth Division, the funds. So he's still going to be working in the corporate side for the next couple of years, but also easing back into financial planning, which is obviously your passion. So let's unpack some of the financial planning stuff. I mean, recently we heard about the budget speech. I mean, what an opportune time to be able to talk about one of the most exciting budget speeches we've heard in years.
Yeah, I totally agree, Alec. And recently, obviously, we had a client presentation in Port Elizabeth, and we were a little bit worried pre-budget because the previous budget speeches have been a little bit drab and dreary, but this most recent budget speech was absolutely phenomenal, especially from a personal financial planning point of view. But I'd love to touch on the budget speech more from a national point of view quickly. I'm very positive about South Africa. Alec, you mentioned Cameron living overseas. I've got a lot of family living overseas, but I think South Africa still has a great future. There's still a lot going on behind the scenes, but I want people to be positive and patient. A lot of taxes could have actually been passed on to us in this most recent budget speech. A number of about 20 billion was mentioned. We didn't experience that. For example, a VAT increase or hikes in marginal tax rates. We saw a lot of dispensation, Alec, and maybe you want to touch on that more from a strategic side, or do you want to hop into the personal side of the budget?
Well, excuse me. Let's dive straight into probably one of the most profound changes, the tax-free savings account. You know, that went from an allowance of 36,000 Rand a year to 46,000 Rand. And it's basically the government saying to the people, you can save and we will never bug you about the capital you save or the growth on that capital. You can have it all. No taxes going forward. Obviously, in normal investments, you get capital gains tax, you get tax on the income that you earn, there's dividends tax at source. So a whole lot of taxes. So tax-free savings accounts are really a good thing. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, tax-free savings accounts or investments, as they're known, maybe more commonly, are a phenomenal investment out there. I think, and we're going to be open and honest, Alec, like early doors when tax-free accounts were brought to the market, we thought, how much value is this actually going to add to a person's financial plan? I can remember those days before I went to Cape Town, we had these conversations, but slowly we've really seen the value that a tax-free savings investment can make or add to one's financial plan. I think there are certain uses, so it's not always meaning that, for example, if you've got a child, for example, they should necessarily be saving into a tax-free savings investment, but we are going to unpack that in a little bit more detail. But I think high level, Alec, in my opinion, personally, every person should, especially in retirement, have a tax-free investment. And also if you're accumulating towards retirement, for example, there is a place, but not necessarily the first starting point when accumulating liquid investments.
So I want to use an example, but first of all, you mentioned when it first came out, we were, 36,000 Rand a year. You know, is it really going to be a benefit and whatever? And I was slow on the uptake until I started seeing the benefit in some of the client portfolios that we'd utilized it in. And so a couple of years ago, I got started, probably 7 or 8 years too late, but it's never too late. So I got started, much like the podcast. And so let's talk about Matthew. So Matthew is 30, and this is a hypothetical example, but the figures are real. So Matthew is 30. He hears about this thing, tax-free savings account, because he listens to Solving the Riddle podcast, and he says, right, let's get going. 46,000 Rand a year. He's in it for 10 years. He's committed. And in year 11, he hits 40,000 Rand, and he's ready to go. He leaves that money until he's 60. So remember, he invested from 30 to 41. He leaves it to 60. At 60, at a growth rate of 10% per annum, which is very reasonable, he has got over 5 million Rand tax-free, no taxes. Okay. Annabelle, on the other hand, she's like Alec, she starts a bit late, right? So at the age of 40, she starts. But she decides, no, she needs to invest more. So she avoids the tax-free savings account. She invests in a unit trust, and she invests more than double, 100,000 Rand a year. But she invests for 20 years till age 60. So she invests 2 million Rand. Remember that Matthew invested 500,000 Rand. Guess how much Annabelle has got at age 60.
No idea, Alex.
She's got exactly the same amount.
Even though she contributed way more.
Absolutely. That's the power of compounding. Very important. You get that. And I mentioned 46,000 a year for 10 years plus 40. That's the cap, 500,000. So he couldn't have contributed more into a tax-free savings account even if he wanted to. So those funds would have been redirected to a new investment.
I want to interject there. So we're speaking about the 500,000 lifetime limit.
Yeah.
We're speaking about 46, 40. So let's just unpack that a little bit, and also the implications if you contribute too much, Alex. So I'm more than happy you brought up tax-free. I'm just posing a question to you. I don't want to obviously interject too much, but I think it's very important for our listeners to understand.
Well, interestingly, I had a meeting with Richard Loyson of Loyson's Tax. He's a tax expert. He used to lecture on tax at the university. And we were touching a little bit on the budget speech. And he said he's really frustrated with the 500,000 limit. So he has already presented to Treasury that if they've raised the contribution, they need to raise that. The second thing he said, that they have 2 or 3 times a year clients saying, oh, I got a penalty from SARS. 40% tax penalty on anything contributed above the limit. So if the limit's 46, don't think you can have one with private wealth management, one with the bank, because you're going to lose 40% of the second one. So you need to ensure that you cap that limit. So that's incredibly important. I just want to come back to Annabelle. So remember, Annabelle's got the same amount of money as Matthew. But guess what? It's taxable. So she contributed 2 million rand. There's about a 3 million rand capital gain, and the government is waiting. They are lurking, waiting for you to cash that money in or to die and trigger capital gains tax.
And when that money carries on growing in retirement, a key thing. So like you said now, Alec, when you withdraw that money, you could trigger a capital gains tax event, but there's also dividends withholdings tax implication locally, 20%. Your foreign dividends could be taxed, your interest component could be taxed. And I just like to touch on that. If you look from an interest exemption point of view, naturally, or I shouldn't say naturally, but for a long time now in the budget speech, that interest exemption hasn't been increased. So for people under the age of 65, should I say, it's been 23,800 for a long period of time. People 65 and over, it's 34,500. So I love the point, Alec. It's you just got to benefit from compounding over time. And that's like I always say to clients, it's like the 8th wonder of the world, the 12th wonder of the world, that we need to front load our savings culture, right? Because that's really where we benefit from compound interest.
And starting early, I cannot emphasize enough. So let's forget about the 46,000 now, because it's about 3,800 a month. That's out of the reach of most people who are just starting a job or even waitressing. But they can contribute 500 rand a month. Yeah. Get started. Because yes, there's a ceiling, 46,000 rand a year, but 500 rand a month is 6,000 a year. There's no minimal event except for the minimum for the investment. But just get started, whether it be 500 rand, whether it be 1,000 rand, or whatever the case is. Start contributing. And if you're a young investor or a new investor or an old investor, the priority has to be tax-free savings accounts.
And I can't agree more, Alec. I speak from personal experience. I fortunately landed up engaging with you at a very young age, just returned from the UK, started saving at a young age, and I have front-loaded my savings journey, but that has benefited me because, and you'll also understand with kids, stepkids, etc., they are expensive. Let's not shy away from that. And you run into expenses which are rather large. And unfortunately, it does put pressure on your cash flow. I'm the first one to put my hand up and say, and I can relate to that. It's tough out there from a cash flow point of view. Things are getting more and more expensive, but that also highlights the importance of front loading your savings and retirement journey, Alec.
And we'll talk more about that and, the cost of university and the cost of children in probably our next episode. I think we're going to talk on how much is enough, and we can incorporate there. But tax-free savings is a great one, but there's so many more to unpack. Yeah. So I want to touch on offshore allowances. Maybe you can come in here and talk about that.
Okay, so offshore allowances, Alec, plain and simply, it's quite easy these days to take money offshore in South Africa. Pre the most recent budget speech, each taxpayer could take up to R1 million. That was known as their discretionary allowance. They could take that offshore and, for example, invest in hard currency, US dollars, GBP or pounds, euros, whatever foreign currency, plain and simply, they wanted to invest in. This year in the budget speech, they announced that they were doubling. They were increasing the discretionary allowance, so call it your offshore allowance, from 1 to 2 million per taxpayer. And I think that's phenomenal. A lot of concern around here in South Africa that people, the government is controlling us. They want us to invest in South Africa. But in the most recent budget speech, they're making it a lot easier for us to move money offshore, Alec. I think it's very important for younger people as well. It's not necessarily just the 1 million rand. So you don't need to take that chunk, that full 1 million or 2 million rand now and move it offshore. There's also mechanisms where we can implement debit orders, for example, as low as 10,000 rand for people that actually want to take money from rands or ZAR and invest it into hard currency, US dollars. It doesn't have to be in these convoluted, complex structures. It doesn't have to be in our terminology, and we can also unpack that, Alec, in future podcasts, wrapped or unwrapped. It's quite a seamless process. So for me, Alec, I'm super excited once again because the world we live in my mind, from an investment landscape and opportunity point of view, is really flat. But I'd like to know and hear from you, Alec, what do you think with regards to investing offshore, the discretionary allowance that was increased from 1 to 2 million?
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic opportunity. Remember, when you move money offshore, it doesn't mean you're emigrating. It just means that you're going to park some money offshore. And you've got hard currency, you've got dollars. So if there's any risks geographically, politically in South Africa, you've got your dollars. You never have to bring them back, but you can bring them back if you want to. And let's talk about the rand and the dollar. So I remember taking Michael Scout from Zwedi Township here, the late Michael Scout, to the Hokkaido Marathon, where the 2021 Olympics marathon was run. And he won that race and $50,000, and I earned $5,000 as the coach. I left $1,000 behind in an investment. That was at R2.72.
Cheapest.
The rand is now 16.98. And so without any growth in the investment, I've got 6 times the return because it was over a very long period. And that's the benefit you get. If you take since the rand was launched in 1961, I think those days a rand would get you $1.60.
Sure.
Amazing, huh? And the rand is depreciated on average. It doesn't matter whether it's before the new government or Nelson Mandela being released, that first 30-odd years, the rand depreciated on average 6% per annum. The next 30 years, it's depreciated 6% per annum. Now, if we talk about that, without any growth in your investment, if you take a 10 or 12-year time horizon and the rand is going to depreciate by 6% per annum, your money will double every 12 years with zero growth in the investment. But now you've taken your money offshore, you've got better investment or wider investment opportunities. Remember, South Africa is about 0.4% of the world markets.
Our global GDP.
Yeah. So you've got diverse options. You can invest. You get into the tech companies where the major growth has been. Geographical diversification, currency diversification. You can be investing in dollars, pounds, euros, all in the same fund. And offshore does sound a bit difficult. I remember before I came into financial planning, I thought, gee, that's far too high a grade for me to go and invest into. But you realize investing offshore is as easy investing as investing in a local unit trust.
Totally agree, Alec. And speaking to your point now, you raised some valid points there. If you look at the local stock market, plain and simply, the JSE, realistically, there's like 60 to 70 companies that you can actually invest in. If you go globally, you can invest in thousands upon thousands of companies. And diversification is your one free lunch in investing.
And if I can just come in here, the client or the investor doesn't have to choose those companies. You can get a professional fund manager to do that for you, and these guys are really good at what they do.
And just bringing us back, a great point, Alec, but to the currency conversation, I think a big challenge for investors is they watch the rand, and the rand, let's just say against the dollar, it blows out. So it goes from 16 to 20, then it goes from 20 back to 18. And a big thing for us is to manage those emotions because the currency is going to ebb and flow. We're seeing a massive crisis in the Middle East. Naturally, we've seen the rand blow out. But when you're investing offshore, that rand becomes a diversifier. It becomes a cushion. And that's a big part of our job, is obviously to walk that journey with clients and explain to them what's happening within the investment. Once again, bring it back, sorry, Alec, to diversification, fundamentally important. But you had something you wanted to share, Alec? Please.
Yeah, it's also a shock absorber. So we take COVID, the rand blew out to 19, and people didn't want to invest because the rand was, it was expensive to buy dollars. But the rand had blown out 20%, but the offshore markets has dropped 40. So if you took it out at the highest point of the rand, you were getting such a discount. And those people who invested during COVID have been the big winners.
I think the key thing everyone can hear and see is it's a passion of ours, but we're going to unpack offshore investing in future podcasts. Alec, between you and I'd like to unpack the retirement fund contribution that was increased recently in the budget speech from 350,000 to 430,000. And we've spoken to some local tax consultants. We've also spoken to tax consultants around the country. And for them, this is a massive win for accumulators or people that are contributing towards their savings. I think the key thing to understand, it's not just your money that you're contributing, it's also a certain percentage that is tax deductible with regards to your risk benefits that are approved. And also in future podcasts, we will unpack that in detail. But Alec, please, let's just unpack for our listeners and our viewers the retirement fund contribution, 350 to 430, but also just making sure that everyone's aware that that is capped at 27.5%
of income. Yeah. So I think the important thing here is the benefit from 350 to 430 is essentially for the high net worth individuals. But I want to speak to the everyday person and give you an example. If you earn, for example, 600,000 Rand, right? Your tax rate is probably 36 to 39%. But let's just round it off to 40%. You can contribute 27.5% of that, which is 165,000. Let's just say you invest 100,000 Rand and your tax rate is 40%. I put 100,000 into the retirement EOT. I get a tax deduction or rebate of 40%, which is 40,000 Rand I get back. How much have I actually invested of my money? Only 60,000. Without any growth, my fund value is 100,000. I only invested 60. 40 over 60 is 66% growth because SARS's contribution back to me.
What should that person be doing with that 40,000 Rand, Alex? So I love your example, but I'm already thinking ahead, like all the conversations we've had, all the workings, all the graphs, all the numbers we've crunched and scenarios. So like you say, they're getting that deduction, so they're getting that 40,000 Rand back. But what should that person actually be doing with that 40,000 Rand?
Okay, so obviously, as I say, in the next podcast, we're going to talk about how much is enough and how to build a bit of a plan. But you've got a plan, and that plan should include retirement savings, discretionary savings. So the best place to build that 40, tax-free savings account. Now you've got a retirement EOT and a tax-free savings account, two for the price of one. You are going to become incredibly wealthy, and your financial independence will be guaranteed.
Yeah, I love it, Alec. And like you said, we're going to go into that sort of detail. I think why I'm also once again so excited and passionate about this is that the financial planning landscape is so diversified, it's so diverse, and we can break this down to the 12th decimal, and that everything is intertwined. So people can maximize their contribution about 36,000 Rand a month. Like you said, that is the high net worth individual that's capped at 430,000. But I think the key thing to also understand for people, I'll speak about, Alec, the growth within the investment, and then I'd like you to touch briefly on the estate planning side with regards to contributions to retirement funds. So anything that you contribute to a retirement fund, so let's just call it your work retirement, is tax deductible. But like we said, Alec, it's capped at now 430,000 per tax year, or 27.5% of taxable income. But all the growth within a retirement fund, so call it your work retirement, is tax-free. You don't pay any capital gains tax. Your interest is tax-free. There's no local dividends at 20%. But I think a key thing that people probably don't understand is the benefits also from an estate planning point of view, Alec. If you wouldn't mind unpacking that for us.
Fantastic. Because as soon as you get the money into the retirement space, it's excluded from your estate. So think of a high net worth individual who's got an estate worth 40 million Rand. Only the first 7 million Rand does not attract estate duty. Anything above that is estate duty, 20% on the first 30 million, 25% thereafter. Okay. But if I've got 20 of that 40 million in retirement funds, that's also excluded from an estate duty point of view. So there's a massive bonus there for the kids or the surviving spouse who's going to inherit and so forth. But I also want to tell you, we touched on how the benefit of this RA change from 350 to 430 is for the high net worth clients. So let's talk about an example. I went up to Centurion the other day and I did a presentation on Section 10C. So we used an example, or the real life example, of a client who had annuity income of 60,000 Rand a month. He had a property He had 25 or 30 million rand in unit trust, so he had lots of liquidity.
Liquidity, yeah.
And he had a 9 million rand windfall. What should he do with it? Okay, right. We need to ring fence this. It's ultimately for the kids, but we still want the money in case there's a lifestyle change. There's already more than enough capital. But what can we do with the 9 million that's going to be efficient from a succession planning point of view and in the short term? So using Section 10C, and we'll go into that more in details in future, but let me just give you the benefits. For the next 10 years, you save 312,000 Rand a year on income tax. On a 10-year lifespan, he saved 7 million Rand in estate duty, and he saved just short of 1 million Rand in capital gains tax. So it's the 9 million Rand caused about 9 million Rand worth of tax savings, and the 9 million Rand is growing tax-free and outside of the estate. So when that value is 20 or 25 million in 10 years' time, to give to the kids, there's no estate duty, no shrinkage.
Once again, Alec, there's just so much going on in the financial planning realm. And like you said, in our next podcast, we're going to speak to how much is enough. I think the next topical thing, and when I've been out and about, seeing people I haven't seen for over 7 or 8 years, the one big thing that's been popping up in my world is capital gains tax. And there's been quite a lot of changes with regards to capital gains tax in the recent budget speech, your primary residence exclusion, your annual exclusion on death, and then the small business CGT or capital gains tax exclusion. So I'm going to start from a primary residence point of view. That exclusion was sitting at 2 million, Alec. That's increased to 3. That's a 50% increase. I think the key thing, I was having a coffee at Seattle in Walmer the other day, and someone said to me, goodness gracious, so now if I sell my house for more than 3 million, I'm going to have a capital gains tax issue. And I said, no. It's 3 million. The 3 million speaks to the gain that you make on the
growth
sale.
only.
It's the growth only. I think that's fundamentally important because all of us, or not all of us, but a lot of us are owning a primary residence or aiming to obviously buy a property for and hold for the long term. So
can I just come in here quickly,
yeah,
Andrew?
Of course, Alec.
What's also very important, you buy a property for 2 million, okay, and you might sell it 20 years later for whatever value. Over those 20 years, you will have made improvements to the house. It is imperative that you keep steps. Sat with a client yesterday. They've got a property that they bought for 200,000 Rand. They've got proof of improvements they've made to the tune of 800,000 Rand. So the base cost of that property is 1 million Rand, not what they bought it for.
And the improvement, plain and simply, the way I also think you explain like this, Alec, when we speak about improvements, it's the additions that you make to the trunk of the tree, right? So not the fruits that you eat necessarily. The fruits are something else. But in my mind, the way I always explain it to clients is that core, like structural changes that you actually make. So it's not like painting, for example.
Yeah, it's not maintenance.
It's not cosmetic stuff, right? It's more the actual physical changes that you make or the additions that you make to the trunk of the tree. So, Alec, let's also speak about...
Before you go further, let's just talk about that primary residence. Why would government make that change? Because this is quite a nice one for them. Well, one of the reasons is the 2 million primary exclusions only came in as far ago or as long ago as 2012. It hasn't changed since then. So what's happening is people bought a property, let's say 20 years ago, and it's increased enormously amount in value, but they don't want to sell because they're scared of capital gains tax. So let's use an example. A year ago, I had a property for 2 million. I sell it for 5. I make a gain of 3. That's 180,000 Rand SARS is going to take off me. That's when we do the whole CTT calculation. I'm not going into that. But 180,000 Rand speeding fine from the tax. With the new primary residence exclusion, there's no tax. So it's 180,000 Rand saving. And that is incredibly important. So why would government do this? Well, they, I think, have found that there's a bit of a lockup in properties. People are not selling because of this exclusion being too low. So the market sort of shrinks because nobody's moving. Now it opens up the opportunity for people to sell properties, buy new properties, stimulate the economy, allow others to come back into the property market.
Yeah, I've got a slightly different view, but I don't think I want to go into too much detail on that, Alec. I think the key thing where I'm really passionate and excited about is more from an annual exclusion point of view, the 40 to 50, and then also from a small business point of view. Once again, we've chatted to some experts locally and nationally from a small business capital gains tax point of view. But let's unpack that annual exclusion that our taxpayers actually benefit from now, Alec. So currently, or in the most recent budget speech before they made changes, was only 40,000. They've increased that by 20% to 50. I think the key thing is that we make use of that annual exclusion on an annual basis with our clients. We're always cognizant of raising the base cost for our clients. Maybe just explain that in some practical examples, Alec, in a day-to-day environment when engaging with clients with regards to the annual exclusion, number one, 40 is now 50, and how you actually take advantage of that on an annual basis with your clients.
I think that's incredibly important. That's basic hygiene in a financial planning business. You've got to be doing this all the time. So if you've got a unit trust, let's just use an example of R1 million, and let's say you're going to retire now, and you call it 60. Your retirement plan is 20 or 30 years long, right? Now, if you leave that R1 million and you don't touch it because you don't need it, and it grows, let's say, for example, I don't know how long along the curve we go, but let's just say it grows to R3 million. It's a potential capital gain of R2 million, right? 40% of what's included for tax purposes, 800,000. Yeah. And of course, at a 45% tax rate, we're looking at 360,000 rands worth of tax. But what happens if we said to the client, as we do every year, well, here's your unit trust, you don't have a need to do a withdrawal, but let's just switch an amount to trigger a capital gain just below the threshold of 50,000 rand. Okay? And if we do that over a 20-year period, we've raised the base cost by 20 times 50, which is R1 million. And we've halved the tax at the end to 180,000 rand.
360. I totally agree, Alec. And I think the key thing is we've worked on so many sums and looking at this. And yes, from an admin point of view, it's a lot of work for us as a business and as financial planners. But you highlighted that over the long term, it's a saving on tax of 180,000 rand, which is massive. I think the key thing also from my point of view, Alec, is that no one likes to pay tax. But from a capital gains tax point of view, the maximum, plain and simply, tax rate that an investor or client can pay is 18%, and that is equivalent to the lowest marginal tax rate. And I think that's fundamentally important to understand for clients when looking at capital gains tax. No one wants to pay capital gains tax, but if you're paying at the max tax rate, and we call it the effective rate of 18%, it's still a really good tax rate to actually incur. And I think the key thing that we've unpacked in quite a lot of detail already, and once again, we'll unpack this in a lot of detail in future podcasts, is that there's options, there's flexibility, and that's what we're always thinking about with our clients. There's retirement products. We've spoken about tax-free savings investments or accounts. We've spoken about unit trusts. But Alec, let's just move on.
Before you go on, let's just unpack that 18% because some of the listeners might be confused. I know I would have been confused 20 years ago. So let's just think about that, because the first tax you pay, somebody earning 100 or 200,000 rand is going to pay 18% tax. So it doesn't sound real for somebody who's got millions. So what we're talking about here is if you've got a capital gain of R1 million, 40% of that is included. So 400,000 is included, and your top tax rate is 45%. 45% of 400 is 180. And that 180 over the million is the 18% that you are referring to. So we must just remember that. Now, I'm going to swing you a curveball because I don't like this one. Small businesses and capital gains tax. Off you go.
Yeah, so we're having a good chuckle. So like we referred to earlier at our recent client presentation, I put a couple of people on the spot. So I think a lot of clients we engage with, and more with the younger generation coming through, Alec, they are really entrepreneurial, right? So they've got multiple businesses, and we define them as small businesses. And there's actually a separate capital gains tax exclusion that's available to small businesses in South Africa. And I'm going to keep it simple and to the point. If you're age 55 or older and you now want to sell your small business, there is a separate capital gains tax exclusion, which was recently increased by 50% in the budget speech from 1.8 million to 2.7 million. So just keep in mind, you need to be 55 and older. You're selling your small business.
You're smelling retirement.
I'm smelling battling retirement and thinking about retirement. Thank you, Alec. But the key thing to also note is there is a cap on the value of that business. Okay, it's 15 million or lower, and that was also recently increased in the recent budget speech from 10 million to 15 million. So for us, and like I said, when engaging with clients around their financial plan, this is something that a lot of financial planners, I'll be brutally honest, probably forget about. You're always focusing on the 40 to 50 from a capital gains tax exclusion point of view. But yeah, I recently engaged with a family member, and they own 2 small businesses. And I sent them a WhatsApp to say, hey, you've just got a small windfall in your financial plan. You don't have to retire at 62 anymore. You can retire at 61. And they were so interested. Why? So it's just making the budget speech relatable and making it understandable for people. Alec.
And I think another big thing for small businesses was the VAT.
You're massive, Alec.
This is huge. So if you're a small business and you had a R1 million turnover, you had to register for VAT. Now, it's not about necessarily the VAT you have to pay, because it's inputs and outputs. It's the administrative burden that every month you have to do this. You have to employ somebody to do it. Otherwise, because I can tell you now, I remember back in the day when I used to have a company called Max Africa. I was taking athletes all over the world and to all the major marathons and so forth. And I had a part-time lady saying, right, okay, fine. Here's business is a bit short. Here's 50,000 Rand, whatever. She didn't structure it as a loan account. And when I closed the business, I had an audit from the VAT people, and every single money that I'd put into that business, I got charged VAT on.
Oof.
Okay, so you cannot afford to make mistakes. But anyway, it's moved from R1 million to 2.3 million. That is huge. So now, and because you remember, many of the small businesses will have turnover of below 2.3, but more than R1 million. All of those businesses now can start saving a little bit of money, a little bit of time. So that is a huge benefit.
It takes us back to what we spoke about up front, Alec, about compounding. It's all those small things, right? It just frees the small businesses up from an admin point of view, accounting point of view. And now we're freeing up people to actually focus on their passion, right? And stimulate the economy. So once again, just feeding it back into that theme that we spoke about up front, we both very, very passionate and very proud. And I think things we're starting to see at a national level, a ruling party level, a government level, things are starting to filter through, and yeah, we're super excited. But there's 2 more things I think we want to discuss today, Alec. One is 2-part, which we'll touch on last because that's been very topical for a long period of time. But let's just touch on donations tax, Alec. Also, there's a big change. That change was last implemented in 2008. So donations, or the donations allowance, has been 100,000 per taxpayer. But Alec, I'd like you, and throw this curveball to you, is we always speak of the donations allowance of 100,000 per taxpayer, but how do, once again, we make use of that in financial planning, and what has actually happened in the recent budget speech?
Okay. Well, that has moved from 100 to 150. So that's massive. For a couple, that means you can get a 300,000 Rand out of your estate. So think of estate duty. If you move 300 out of your estate, if you've got a large estate, every year you can move this out, and we'll talk about where to in a moment. Every year for 20 years, you've moved 6 million plus the growth on whatever you've moved out of the estate to avoid 20% estate duty. That's a massive saving in itself. But many people, parents, want to get money to their kids, or to reduce their loan account in the trust, or whatever they might have. But let's talk about the children, the adult children. Adult children, we know. You spoke about the sandwich generation before we started. That parents want to help the kids. Parents want to help the grandchildren. So, how do you get money to them without paying 20% donations tax?
It's almost like a form of an advanced inheritance. Hey?
Correct.
That's what people are always trying to help grandchildren, kids. Like I said earlier with my kids, cash flow can become tight at certain phases of life. You experience a bit of a squeeze, and like you say, parents naturally want to help their grandkids, they want to help their kids, and this is how legally they can do it. They don't have to draft a loan agreement, go through those complexities. They can actually donate 150,000 mom, 150,000 Rand.
So I must remember one thing, because your mom has been a client of mine for a long time.
Yeah.
So I need to remind her that the donation to Andrew can go from 100 to 150. Although you'll have to remind her, because you're taking her over as a client from now on.
Indeed. And then, Alec, you mentioned 6 million earlier. I'm just thinking the 6, I think you're referring to the 7 million, the 3.5 plus the 3.5, which is the two Section 4A abatements. So that I just want to tie that up.
So
or were you doing a calculation in
so
your
think
head?
of the estate duty a couple of things. So you got an estate duty abatement. Every taxpayer gets 3.5 million rand free of estate duty, and on the first dying, you can use it or don't. We generally say you should use it because then the growth is outside of the estate, if the plan can accommodate it.
Totally agree.
So that's potentially a 7 million saving. Usually the donations allowance over 20 years, that can be another 6 million. But here's the thing. Again, it comes down to hygiene within the business. It has to happen regularly. But it can only happen for those clients who have more than enough. For those who've got whatever we're going to quantify in the next podcast is how much is enough. Sometimes you can't take money out of the financial plan because you couldn't put your own retirement at risk.
Liquidity, etc. Yeah. So, Alec, I've had a great conversation today. I've really enjoyed this. I'm sure our listeners and our viewers have. I've enjoyed spending time with you, but I think the last topical point we need to touch on is the two-pot. I don't know if I want to throw that curveball your way, and then you can start it, then you can throw it back at me. I'll start, okay? So the two-pot system in South Africa has been very topical. It was obviously only recently introduced. We have a lot of healthy debates in this office with regards to the benefit of two-pot. Is it actually benefiting people accumulating towards retirement? So let me actually unpack what we mean by the two-pot system, right? So plain and simply, if you had to start saving today and you had to start saving 3,000 Rand, they would take your 3,000 Rand debit order. Okay, we're saving monthly. 2,000 Rand would go into the retirement component or the retirement pot, and the other 1,000 Rand a month would go into the savings component or the savings pot. Why I'm saying component and pot, it's called the two-pot system. But from a legislative and legal point of view, they've actually broken those pots up into components. So in your mind, and as an investor, as a client, as a financial planner, it's the retirement component and the savings component. Okay, that retirement component can never be touched. So when you retire, what you're going to have to do is buy some form of, call it an annuity, okay, with that 2/3, that retirement component. And I say never can be touched. There are slight nuances where you can. Okay, we wouldn't advise that you do.
Let's stick to the 98%.
Yeah, exactly, the 98%. But then that 1/3, the savings pot or the savings component, that's like ideally your liquidity in retirement, right, Alec? But also the one thing that we have a concern with is that that retirement component is actually, the savings component is accessible now. So you as an investor, as a client, as a taxpayer can actually access that savings component. But there's tax implications, Alec. And what I mean from a tax implication point of view is that you're going to pay tax. Once again, we referred to marginal tax rates a little bit earlier. So you've now benefited from a deduction, Alec, on your contribution, okay, on the 3,000. But what the tax man is saying, or SARS are saying, is now you're going to access your savings component. We are now going to deduct tax at source. And what we are also seeing in the industry, Alec, which is a big issue and a challenge, is that the right amount of tax is also not being deducted at source. So now people are getting their funds from their savings component during the tax year. And what this is now creating is a tax liability when you submit your tax return, which is obviously a massive red flag. Alec, I think I've given quite a detailed and lengthy explanation. Is there anything else that you want to speak to?
Yeah, just two things. Firstly, thank goodness SARS didn't tamper with the two-pot. So they haven't increased the accessibility
in
of
the recent
capital.
budget speech, totally.
Because what we've realized is, unfortunately in our business, we don't have people accessing the savings pot. But in the industry, it's literally thousands upon hundreds of thousands of people who are accessing the savings pot, which is meant to be for their retirement. In the past, you couldn't touch this money. And that was great because people were forced to keep it for retirement. People are, we live in an instant gratification society. They want the money now. They're prepared to pay the tax so they can go on a holiday. But they're not going to have holidays in retirement if they continue to do that. So my suggestion is, please do not touch the savings pot.
Totally agree, Alec. And today we've spoken about so much, right? And the budget speech can be confusing. It can be complicated. And the same can actually be applied in being spoken about or spoken to about financial planning, right? Financial planning has a lot of moving parts. It is potentially complicated. It is potentially confusing to investors and clients. But that's where we believe we add so much value. And that's what we're going to speak to in our next podcast is how much is enough. But from your side, Alec, is there anything else that you would like to add before we close out?
Yeah, I think the important thing is, we're speaking off the cuff here. This
Most
should not
definitely.
be construed as advice. Very
Most
important.
definitely not.
Yeah. So, take it as, general conversation. If you need professional advice, we're available. All of the private wealth management offices throughout the country are available, all professional certified financial planners. So that's key. But some of you don't want to see a financial planner. That's cool. Then just subscribe, like, comment, ask questions.
Please.
Let us know what you want to hear about. We are planning our second podcast, being How Much Is Enough. But if you want to hear about something else, let us know. In Spotify, there's a comment section. YouTube, there's a comment section. Comment if you like what you're talking about. If you think we're talking rubbish, let us know. And if you want to ask questions, we'd be grateful for them.
Yeah, I totally agree, Alec. We're here to speak about anything finance related. Our industry is so broad, and I think what all our listeners and viewers can see and hear is that we're so passionate about this, and certain topics we might not have that much knowledge on, but we're going to step away, we're going to go investigate, interrogate, ask questions, and we can come back to our viewers and listeners and unpack these complicated themes or questions or challenges that people are facing out there.
Another thing we've got as a goal of the podcast is that maybe not every second one as a pattern, but every second one over the course of the year. So 50% of the podcast, we will likely have a guest in half of the podcast. We will speak to somebody about something specific where they can add a lot more value than we can, where they can unpack certain stuff, where they will have something interesting to say. So let us know who you'd like to hear of. The only person we can't get is Stephen Bartlett yet, until we've got about 100,000 subscribers. Once we've got that, maybe we'll chat to him.
Yeah, most definitely, Alec. And once again, just a massive thank you to all our viewers and our listeners. Just a big thank you from myself, Andrew Whitewood, and to you, Alec Riddle, for obviously being on the podcast, for forming this partnership. And I'm looking forward to an exciting future.
Excellent. Thanks, Andrew.
Cheers, guys.